At your age, Mom, isn't it almost time anyway?
The words cut deeper than the surgeon's scalpel. My son David stood beside my hospital bed at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Bills clutched in his hand like evidence in a trial. 75 years old, 3 days post-heart surgery. And he was asking me if I should just die already. His eyes held no warmth, just cold calculation, like I was a stock he needed to sell before it lost more value. Something inside me shattered, not my surgically repaired heart, the other one. The mother's heart that had beaten for him for 48 years. In that sterile room, surrounded by beeping monitors and the smell of antiseptic, I made a decision that would change everything. They thought I'd accept it. Shuffle quietly into a nursing home. Become invisible. They were wrong. This is how I disappeared, not into death, but into life. My own life. For the first time ever. The fluorescent lights in Northwestern Memorial Hospital never really turned off. They just dimmed slightly after visiting hours, casting everything in that perpetual twilight. That made it impossible to tell if it was 3 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning. Eleanor Hayes had been staring at those lights for 72 hours now, watching dust particles float through the beams like tiny boats on a colorless sea. Her chest hurt. Of course it hurt. They'd cracked her sternum open 3 days ago, stopped her heart, fixed a valve that had been failing for months, and stitched her back together like a torn jacket. 15 centimeters of surgical staples held her together, now, pulling tight every time she breathed. But that pain was manageable. Expected. The morphine took care of most of it. It was the other pain, the one blooming in her chest, that had nothing to do with surgery, that kept her awake. Eleanor shifted slightly in the hospital bed, trying to find a position that didn't make her feel like she was being squeezed in a vice. The IV in her left arm pulled uncomfortably. Monitors beeped their steady rhythm, tracking a heart that was supposedly better now. Stronger. Worth the $85,000 in medical bills that insurance hadn't covered. $85,000. Her entire life savings had been $42,000. She'd been so proud of that number. Built up over decades of tips and careful budgeting. Gone now, plus another $43,000 in debt that would take years to pay off. If she had years left. The question her son had asked kept echoing in her mind. At your age, Mom, isn't it almost time anyway? She'd replayed those words 1,000 times since yesterday, trying to find a different meaning in them. Some way to interpret them that didn't make her feel like she'd wasted 48 years of her life. But no matter how she turned them over, they meant the same thing. Her son thought she should die soon, and the money spent keeping her alive was wasteful. David, her baby. The tiny 7-pound miracle she'd held at Cook County Hospital in December of 1976. When she was just 27 years old and her husband Robert was still alive. And everything had seemed possible. The door opened quietly. Eleanor didn't need to look to know it was a nurse. Nurses moved differently than visitors, with purpose and efficiency rather than hesitation. This one was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and hands that were gentle when they checked her vitals. How's your pain level, Mrs. Hayes? On a scale of 1 to 10? 4, Eleanor lied. It was closer to 7. But she'd learned long ago that complaining didn't change anything. It just made people think you were difficult. That's good. Dr. Morrison will be by in about an hour to check on you. Your son called earlier, said he'd be visiting this afternoon. Eleanor's stomach tightened. What time is it? Just past noon. You slept through breakfast, that's good. Your body needs rest. The nurse made notes on her tablet, then smiled. I'll bring you some lunch. Think you can manage some soup? Sure, thank you. When the nurse left, Eleanor closed her eyes. David would be here in a few hours. She should be happy about that, grateful. He was taking time off work to visit his mother. But all she felt was a hollow dread. Like waiting for test results she already knew would be bad. She thought about the first time she'd held him. The maternity ward had been cold that December night. But David had been warm against her chest. His tiny fist curled around her finger with surprising strength. Robert had been there, grinning like he'd personally invented fatherhood. Taking pictures with a camera that seemed enormous compared to the baby in her arms. He's perfect, Robert had whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ellie, we made a perfect person. They had, hadn't they? 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes. A shock of dark hair and lungs that worked beautifully, announcing his presence to the entire floor. Eleanor had counted his heartbeats, memorized the weight of him, made promises she'd meant with every cell in her body. I'll always protect you. I'll always love you. I'll give you everything. And she had. God help her, she had. When Robert died sudden, brutal, a heart attack at 43 while changing a tire on Lake Shore Drive, Eleanor had been 35 with a 16-year-old son and a job waiting tables at Rosie's Diner on Western Avenue. The life insurance barely covered the funeral. The savings account held $2,300. She'd stood in their small apartment in Logan Square, looking at David's college acceptance letter from Northwestern University, and made a decision. He would go. She would make it happen. Whatever it took. What it took was 32 years of her life. 32 years of double shifts at the diner, smiling at customers who called her honey and sweetheart, and sometimes worse things. 32 years of aching feet and grease-stained uniforms and coffee burns on her hands. She'd worked Christmas mornings and Thanksgiving evenings, birthdays and anniversaries that didn't exist because there was no one to celebrate them with. She'd paid for David's undergraduate degree. All 4 years, $60,000 in tuition, plus room and board, plus books and spending money. Because she didn't want him to work during the school year. He needed to focus on his studies, make connections, build a future. Then came graduate school, an MBA from University of Chicago. Another $90,000. Mom, I'll pay you back, David had said, 22 years old and earnest in a way that made her chest ache. Once I get a good job, I'll pay back every penny. She'd believed him, or maybe she just wanted to believe him. Either way, she'd found the money. Took out loans against the diner's good faith in her, picked up extra shifts until her back screamed and her knees swelled. When David got married to Jessica, a sharp-featured woman with calculating eyes and a real estate license, Eleanor had given them $50,000 for a down payment on a house in Lincoln Park. It was everything she'd managed to save in 5 years. Every dollar tucked away in a checking account that earned almost no interest. Mom, you don't have to do this, David had said. But his hand was already reaching for the check. I want to, Eleanor had said. And she had wanted to. Wanted to see her son settled, secure, living the kind of life she'd never had. A life where money wasn't constantly terrifying. That was 8 years ago. David had never mentioned paying her back. The subject simply disappeared, like morning fog burning off the lake. The soup arrived, thin broth with sad vegetables floating in it, and Eleanor forced herself to eat. Her stomach didn't want food, but the nurses would worry if she didn't eat. And she didn't want to be difficult. Difficult patients got talked about, pitied, labeled as problems. She'd spent 75 years trying not to be a problem. The television mounted on the wall was showing a game show. People screaming with joy over winning $1,000. Eleanor watched without really seeing. $1,000. She used to think that was a fortune. Before she knew what hospital bills looked like. Before she understood that her entire life's worth could be measured in surgical procedures and medication costs. At 2:30, the door opened again. This time she knew without looking that it wasn't a nurse. Hey, Mom. David stood in the doorway, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He was 48 now, starting to gray at the temples. In a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. Handsome, tall, everything a mother could want in a son. On paper, anyway. David. Eleanor tried to sit up straighter, winced at the pull of her incision. You didn't have to come. Of course I did. He came in, set his briefcase down, but didn't sit in the visitor's chair. Just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. How are you feeling? Better. The surgery went well. Drive. Morrison said. That's good. A pause. Jessica sends her love. She wanted to come, but she's showing a property in Naperville. Of course she was. Jessica was always showing properties, always busy, always somewhere else. In 8 years of marriage, Eleanor could count on one hand the number of times Jessica had visited her apartment. And those visits had been brief, uncomfortable affairs. where Jessica checked her phone constantly and made comments about the neighborhood. That's fine. Tell her I said hello. Another pause. David shifted his weight, and Eleanor recognized the body language of someone working up to something unpleasant. She'd seen it 1,000 times at the diner, customers about to complain about their food, ask for a discount. Tell her the tip would be less than usual because times were hard. Mom, I need to talk to you about something. Here it was, the reason for the visit. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, and for a moment worried the monitors would start beeping, alerting nurses that something was wrong. But her heart kept its steady rhythm, even as everything inside her went cold. Okay. David finally sat down, pulled the chair close to her bed. He had papers with him. She hadn't noticed them before, but now she saw the manila folder he'd been carrying. Hospital bills. She knew before he even opened it. The surgery cost $85,000 after insurance. You don't have that kind of money. I know. I've been thinking about this. He opened the folder, showed her numbers she'd already seen, didn't want to see again. You're 75 years old. The doctor said this valve repair should last 10 to 15 years, but that's in ideal circumstances. With your other health issues, the diabetes, the high blood pressure, realistically, you're looking at what? 5 years? Maybe 7? Eleanor's mouth had gone completely dry. David, I'm not trying to be cruel, Mom. I'm trying to be practical. $85,000 for 5 years. That's $17,000 per year. And that's not counting your other medical expenses, which are only going to increase. The cost of your medications alone is over $600 a month. He was calculating. Right there in front of her, he was calculating the cost-benefit analysis of keeping his mother alive. What are you saying? Her voice came out as barely a whisper. David leaned forward, and his eyes, Robert's eyes, she'd always thought they were Robert's eyes, were completely cold. I'm saying that maybe it's time to think about quality of life versus quantity. There are some very nice assisted living facilities nursing homes, where you could be comfortable and wouldn't have to worry about bills or taking care of yourself. Jessica and I could help with the costs, but Mom. He paused, seemed to be choosing his words carefully. At your age, isn't it almost time anyway? There it was, the question that had been hovering between them since yesterday, finally spoken out loud in the harsh fluorescent light. Isn't it almost time to die? Isn't it wasteful to spend money keeping you alive? Haven't you lived long enough? Eleanor looked at her son, this man she'd raised, sacrificed for, loved with every atom of her being, and realized she was looking at a stranger. Or maybe she'd always been a stranger to him. Maybe all those years of sacrifice had just been her performing a role, playing the part of mother, while David saw her as something else entirely. An investment that hadn't paid off. A liability. A problem to be solved. Get out. David blinked. What? Get out of my room. Her voice was stronger now, fueled by something she'd never felt before, not anger exactly, but something colder. Harder. Leave. Mom, you're being emotional. I know this is hard to hear, but we need to be realistic about. I said get out. She reached for the nurse call button, and David's eyes widened. He stood up quickly, gathering his papers. We'll talk when you're feeling better. When you've had time to think about this rationally. He left. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like the end of something. Eleanor lay back against the pillows, her chest heaving, her heart racing in a way that made the monitors start beeping. A nurse rushed in, checked her vitals, asked what was wrong. Nothing, Eleanor said. I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. Something inside her had broken, not her repaired heart, but something else. Something that had been holding her together for 75 years. And in its place, cold and clear and absolutely certain, was a single thought. I'm done. Done sacrificing. Done shrinking. Done making myself small so other people could be comfortable. Outside her window, Chicago sprawled in the October afternoon light. Somewhere in that city was an apartment she'd lived in for 20 years. Furniture she'd collected. A life she'd built around being useful to other people. Tomorrow, she would start building something different. Tomorrow, she would start building a life for Eleanor Hayes. Not David's mother. Not Robert's widow. Not the woman at the diner who always smiled and never complained. Just Eleanor. For the first time in her entire life. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw David's face, that cold, calculating expression as he'd asked if it wasn't almost time anyway. The words had burrowed into her brain like parasites, feeding on every good memory she'd ever had of him, turning them rotten. The nurse came at 6 in the morning with medications and cheerful small talk about the weather. Eleanor swallowed the pills, nodded at the appropriate moments, and stared out the window as dawn broke over Chicago. The city looked the same as it had yesterday. Buildings still stood, traffic still moved, Lake Michigan still stretched to the horizon like a gray mirror. But everything had changed. Dr. Morrison arrived during rounds, a tall woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and steady hands. She examined Eleanor's incision, checked her vitals, and seemed pleased with the numbers on the monitors. "You're healing beautifully, Mrs. Hayes. If everything continues like this, we can discharge you tomorrow. You'll need to take it easy for at least 6 weeks, no lifting anything over 5 pounds, no driving for a month, and you'll need someone to stay with you for the first week or 2. Someone to stay with her. That would be David, Eleanor supposed. Or more likely Jessica, doing her duty with tight-lipped resentment, checking her watch every 10 minutes. Actually, Eleanor heard herself say, "I'll be fine on my own." Dr. Morrison frowned slightly. "Mrs. Hayes, at your age, after major surgery, it's really not advisable to. I've been taking care of myself for 40 years, doctor. I think I can manage." Something in Eleanor's tone must have convinced her, because Drive. Morrison simply nodded and made a note on her tablet. "Well, we'll have a visiting nurse check on you daily for the first week. And if you experience any chest pain, shortness of breath, or fever, you go straight to the ER. Understood?" "Understood." When the doctor left, Eleanor picked up her phone from the bedside table. She'd been ignoring it since yesterday. 17 missed calls from David, 9 from Jessica, 3 from a number she didn't recognize. There were text messages too, filling her screen with words she didn't want to read. She deleted them all without looking. Then she opened her contacts and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in months: Patricia Chen, her neighbor in the apartment building. Patricia was 63, a retired librarian who lived alone with 2 cats and a plant collection that had taken over her entire living room. The phone rang 3 times before Patricia answered, her voice scratchy with sleep. "Eleanor, is everything okay? It's barely 7. I'm sorry to call so early. I'm at Northwestern Memorial. I had heart surgery a few days ago." "Oh my God, Eleanor. Why didn't you tell me? Are you all right? Do you need anything?" The concern in Patricia's voice made Eleanor's throat tighten. When was the last time someone had asked what she needed without calculating the cost first? "I'm fine. I'm getting discharged tomorrow, and I was wondering if you could help me with something." "Anything. What do you need?" "I need you to go to my apartment and pack some things. Clothes, toiletries, my important documents. They're in the blue folder in my desk drawer. And I need you to call Jim Kowalski." Jim Kowalski was the building superintendent, a gruff Polish man in his 70s who'd lived in Logan Square his entire life. He was also, Eleanor happened to know, looking to sell his daughter's condo in Oregon. "Oregon?" Patricia sounded confused. "Eleanor, what's going on?" "I'm leaving Chicago." The words hung in the air between them, and Eleanor realized this was the first time she'd said it out loud. The first time the decision had become real rather than just a thought spinning in her mind. "Leaving? But your life is here. David is here." "That's exactly why I'm leaving." There was a long pause. Patricia had known Eleanor for 8 years, long enough to read between the lines. "I'll pack your things," Patricia said quietly. "And I'll call Jim." "But Eleanor, are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." After she hung up, Eleanor sat back against the pillows and felt something she hadn't felt in decades: excitement. Not the anxious, worried kind of excitement that came with hoping things would work out. Real excitement, the kind that came from knowing she was about to do something completely for herself. Her phone buzzed. "David." She declined the call. It buzzed again immediately. This time she turned it off completely. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nurse visits, physical therapy sessions, and meals she barely tasted. Eleanor walked the hospital corridors with a physical therapist, managing the required laps around the floor despite the pulling sensation in her chest. Every step felt like practice for something bigger. At 4 in the afternoon, the door to her room burst open. Eleanor looked up to see David, his face flushed and his tie askew. Behind him was Jessica, impeccably dressed as always, her expression tight with what might have been concern or might have been irritation. With Jessica, it was hard to tell. "Mom, we've been trying to reach you all day." David's voice carried an edge Eleanor had never heard directed at her before. Frustration, maybe even anger. "Why aren't you answering your phone?" "I turned it off." "You can't just—" He stopped himself, visibly trying to calm down. Jessica placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that looked supportive. But Eleanor recognized as strategic. She'd seen Jessica do the same thing at family dinners when David was about to say something she considered unwise. "Eleanor," Jessica said, her voice carefully modulated, "we're worried about you. David told me about yesterday, and I think there was a misunderstanding." There was no misunderstanding. He was trying to help. We both were. "We've been looking into some wonderful facilities where you could." "I'm not going to a nursing home." "It's not a nursing home, it's assisted living. There's a difference. These places have activities, social opportunities, medical staff on site." I said no. Jessica's perfectly maintained composure cracked slightly. "Eleanor, you're being unreasonable. You can't take care of yourself after major surgery. You need help." "Then I'll hire help. With what money?" The question came from David, sharp and pointed. "Mom, you're $85,000 in debt. You can't afford." "That's my problem, not yours. It becomes my problem when you can't pay your rent and end up homeless." David's voice had risen, and a passing nurse glanced through the doorway with concern. He lowered his voice but not the intensity. "I'm trying to think about your future here. About what's practical." "Practical." Eleanor tasted the word, found it bitter. "Is that what we're calling it?" "What would you call it?" "I'd call it you wanting me out of the way so you don't have to feel guilty about not visiting. Not calling, not remembering that I exist except when there's a problem." The words came out harder than she'd intended, but she didn't take them back. They'd been building for years, decades, maybe, and now they flooded out like water from a broken dam. David's face went pale. "That's not fair." "Fair? You want to talk about fair?" Eleanor sat up straighter, ignoring the protest from her incision. "I paid for your education. All of it. Northwestern undergrad, University of Chicago MBA. $150,000. I worked double shifts for 12 years to do that. I never asked you to. I gave you $50,000 for your house. Money I'd saved for years. You said you'd pay me back. That was 8 years ago. I never saw a penny of it. We've had expenses. And yesterday, you stood in this room and asked me if it wasn't time for me to die already because keeping me alive is too expensive." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Jessica seemed at a loss for words, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. "I didn't," David started, but Eleanor cut him off. "Get out. Mom, please. I'm being discharged tomorrow. I don't want you there. I don't want you at my apartment. I don't want your phone calls or your texts or your helpful suggestions about nursing homes. You can't be serious." David looked genuinely shocked, as if he couldn't comprehend that his mother, his quiet, accommodating, always there when he needed her mother, was actually refusing him. "Where will you go? What will you do? That's none of your concern anymore. None of my. You're my mother. And you're the son who decided I'd lived long enough." Eleanor's voice was steady now, cold and clear. "So let me return the favor. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have a son anymore." Jessica's intake of breath was audible. David stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions: shock, anger, hurt, disbelief, before landing on something Eleanor had never seen before: fear. "You don't mean that." "I've never meant anything more in my life. Mom, let's take a breath here. We can talk about this when you're feeling better. The stress of the surgery, the medications." "Don't." Eleanor's voice was sharp enough to cut. "Don't you dare tell me I'm not thinking clearly. I've never thought more clearly than I am right now." David opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked to Jessica for support, but even she seemed to have run out of strategies. "I think we should go," Jessica said quietly, tugging at David's arm. "Let Eleanor rest. I'm not leaving until—" "David, we need to go." Something in Jessica's tone got through to him. He let himself be pulled toward the door, but stopped at the threshold, turning back one more time. Mom, please, don't do this. Whatever I said wrong, I'm sorry. I was just trying to help. Eleanor really looked at him and tried to find the baby she'd held 48 years ago. The toddler who'd clung to her legs, the teenager who'd cried at his father's funeral. But all she saw was a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who'd calculated the cost-benefit analysis of keeping his mother alive and found the numbers wanting. Goodbye, David. His face crumpled. For a moment, Eleanor felt something twist in her chest, not pain from the surgery, but the old instinct to comfort him, to take back her words, to make everything okay. The same instinct that had ruled her entire life. She crushed it down. David left. The door closed. Eleanor was alone again. She picked up her phone, turned it back on, and opened her banking app. $42,000 in savings, gone to the hospital. Her checking account held $2,300. Her Social Security payment would come next week, another $1,300. Her apartment cost $800 a month. She did the math. She could last maybe 4 months in Chicago before the debt collectors came calling. Or she could leave. Jim's daughter's condo in Cannon Beach, Oregon. Patricia had texted her the details an hour ago. Was for sale. $180,000 for a small place 3 blocks from the Pacific Ocean. Eleanor had equity in nothing. She rented her apartment, owned her 15-year-old Honda Civic outright, and had no assets except the gold wedding ring she still wore after 40 years of widowhood. But David had equity. $150,000 of her money sat in his Lincoln Park house. Money he'd never paid back, never even mentioned returning. Eleanor opened her contacts again. This time she scrolled to a different name, Lawrence Chen, Patricia's nephew, who happened to be a lawyer specializing in family debt recovery. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment. Then she pressed it. Lawrence? This is Eleanor Hayes, Patricia's friend. I need to talk to you about collecting on a loan. Outside her window, the Chicago sky was turning purple with dusk. In the hallway, the evening shift nurses were beginning their rounds. Somewhere in the hospital, someone was being born, someone was dying, and the world kept turning regardless. Eleanor listened to Lawrence Chen explain her legal options, made an appointment for next week, and felt something she hadn't felt since Robert died. She felt powerful. She felt dangerous. She felt, for the first time in 40 years, like someone who mattered. Not someone's mother. Not someone's problem. Not someone whose value could be calculated in dollars and years remaining. Just Eleanor. And Eleanor was done being nice. The discharge papers came at 9 in the morning. Eleanor signed them with a hand that didn't shake, accepted the prescriptions and follow-up appointment cards, and listened to the nurse's instructions about wound care and activity restrictions with half her attention. The other half was already 3 states away, somewhere on the Oregon coast where the Pacific crashed against rocks and nobody knew her name. Patricia arrived at 10 with a rolling suitcase and a canvas tote bag. Everything you asked for, she said, setting the bags by the door. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and Eleanor realized her friend had been crying. Eleanor, are you absolutely sure about this? Oregon is so far, and you just had major surgery, and… I'm sure. But what about your doctor appointments? Your medications? What if something goes wrong? They have doctors in Oregon, Patricia. They have hospitals and pharmacies and everything else Chicago has, except they also have an ocean and 3,000 miles between me and my son. Patricia sat down heavily in the visitor's chair, the same one David had occupied 2 days ago when he'd asked if it wasn't almost time for her to die. Eleanor wondered if chairs absorbed the cruelty spoken while sitting in them, if Patricia could feel the residue of those words. Jim's daughter is expecting you, Patricia said quietly. Her name is Melissa Kowalski. Well, Melissa Turner now. She got divorced last year, which is why she's selling the condo. She said you can move in as soon as escrow closes, should be about 30 days. 30 days. Eleanor repeated the words, tasting their shape. In 30 days, she would be 75 years old and living alone on the Oregon coast. No son, no family, no history weighing her down like stones in her pockets. It sounded like freedom. Where will you stay until then? I called a motel in Cannon Beach. The Surfside Inn. $120 a night for a room with a kitchenette. It'll do until the condo is ready. Patricia pulled out her phone, opened her banking app, and started typing. I'm sending you $2,000. Patricia, no. Eleanor Hayes, you shut up and take the money. You've lent me money a dozen times over the years, and you never once asked for it back. Her fingers moved across the screen with determination. Besides, I'm not giving it to you. I'm investing in your new life. Consider it a housewarming gift. Eleanor's eyes burned. She blinked hard, refusing to cry. She'd cried enough over the past 48 hours. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just send me pictures of the ocean. A knock at the door interrupted them. Eleanor tensed, expecting David, but it was a hospital orderly with a wheelchair. Mrs. Hayes, I'm here to escort you out. Hospital policy: everyone leaves in a wheelchair, even if they walked a marathon that morning. The ride down to the lobby felt surreal. Eleanor had entered this building 4 days ago on a gurney, barely conscious, her heart failing. Now she was leaving with a repaired valve, a suitcase full of clothes, and a plan that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Patricia had brought Eleanor's car, the ancient Honda Civic that had been making ominous sounds for the past 6 months but refused to die completely. It sat in the parking garage looking small and tired and determined, like Eleanor herself. Are you sure you're okay to drive? Patricia asked, loading the suitcase into the trunk. The doctor said no driving for a month. The doctor said a lot of things. Eleanor slid into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirror, and started the engine. It coughed, sputtered, then caught. Besides, I'm not driving far. Just to my apartment. But that was a lie, and they both knew it. Eleanor's apartment in Logan Square was a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that had been built in 1923 and looked every year of its age. She'd lived there for 20 years, ever since David had gone off to college, and she'd downsized from the 2-bedroom they'd shared in Pilsen. The stairs were harder than she remembered. By the time she reached the 3rd floor, Eleanor was breathing hard and her chest ached. She unlocked the door and stood in the doorway, looking at the life she was about to abandon. It wasn't much. A worn couch from a thrift store. A television that still had a VCR player attached. A kitchenette with appliances from the 1980s. The walls were decorated with photographs: David as a baby, David in his high school graduation gown, David and Jessica on their wedding day. David, David, David. Eleanor walked to the wall and started taking down the pictures. One by one, she removed them from their frames and set them in a box. When the walls were bare, the apartment looked emptier but cleaner, like a wound after the infection has been removed. Her phone rang. David again. She declined the call and blocked the number. It rang again immediately. Jessica this time. Blocked. A text message appeared from an unknown number. Mom, it's me. Please don't shut me out. We can fix this. I'm sorry. Eleanor deleted it and blocked that number too. She spent the rest of the day sorting through her possessions. With the ruthless efficiency of someone who'd spent 75 years accumulating things she didn't need. Clothes went into 2 piles: keep or donate. Kitchen items, books, knickknacks, all assessed and judged. What couldn't fit in her car would be left behind. By 6 in the evening, her entire life had been reduced to 8 boxes, 3 suitcases, and a hanging rack of clothes. The apartment looked like a stage set after the play had ended, empty and purposeless. Eleanor made herself a final meal in the kitchenette: scrambled eggs and toast, the same thing she'd eaten countless times in this space. She sat at the small table by the window and watched the sun set over Chicago. The city lights were beginning to flicker on, millions of them stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, David was probably having dinner with Jessica. Maybe they were discussing her, trying to figure out their next move. Maybe they were relieved she'd taken herself out of the equation, solved their problem for them. Eleanor found she didn't care. At 7, there was a knock at her door. She opened it expecting Patricia, but found instead a man in his mid-30s with kind eyes and a leather messenger bag. Mrs. Hayes, I'm Lawrence Chen, Patricia's nephew. The lawyer. He'd called earlier to say he was coming by, but Eleanor had been so immersed in packing she'd forgotten. Come in. Sorry for the mess. Lawrence stepped inside, looking around at the boxes with understanding. Moving? To Oregon. In 2 days. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't comment. Instead, He sat on the couch, one of the few pieces of furniture still in place, and pulled out a yellow legal pad. Patricia told me about your situation. You loaned your son $150,000 8 years ago for a house down payment. There was no formal promissory note, no written agreement, correct? Correct. He was my son. I trusted him. And he's made no payments on this loan? Not a single dollar. Lawrence wrote something on his pad. Illinois has a 10-year statute of limitations on oral contracts, so you're still within the window to pursue this legally. However, proving the existence of the loan without documentation will be challenging. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a folder, the same blue folder Patricia had packed for her. Inside were bank statements going back 8 years, showing the $50,000 withdrawal from her savings account on June 15, 2016. Below that was a birthday card from David dated a month later. Thanks for everything, Mom. We'll pay you back, I promise. Love, David and Jessica. Lawrence examined the documents, his expression shifting from neutral to something more animated. This is good. This is very good. The bank statement establishes the transfer of funds, and this card, especially with that written promise, can be considered acknowledgement of the debt. Do you have anything else? Emails, text messages, any other written communication where he references the money? Eleanor scrolled through her phone, searching old text messages she'd never had the heart to delete. She found 3 exchanges where David had mentioned paying her back and the money you gave us. She showed Lawrence, who photographed each one with his phone. Mrs. Hayes, I think we have a solid case. I can file a civil lawsuit for recovery of the debt plus interest. At 5% annual interest, which is reasonable and likely what a court would award, you're owed roughly $210,000. $210,000. Enough to buy the condo in Cannon Beach and have money left over for living expenses while she figured out her new life. How long will it take? If he settles quickly, maybe 3 to 6 months. If it goes to trial, could be over a year. I don't have a year. Lawrence looked at her, really looked at her, and seemed to understand something unspoken. There's another option. I can draft a demand letter, send it to him tomorrow via certified mail. It'll lay out the evidence and give him 30 days to pay in full or face a lawsuit. Sometimes the threat of legal action and the potential damage to his reputation is enough to motivate payment. His reputation? If this goes to court, it becomes public record. His employer could find out. Friends, colleagues, a financial professional being sued by his own mother for failure to repay a loan? Lawrence shook his head. That's not a good look. Eleanor thought about David in his expensive suits, his Lincoln Park house, his carefully curated life. She thought about how much he valued appearances, status, respectability. Draft the letter. Are you sure? This will likely end any chance of reconciliation with your son. I'm counting on it. Lawrence spent the next hour at Eleanor's kitchen table, typing on his laptop while she continued packing. By 9 o'clock, he had a 4-page demand letter ready. Eleanor read it through twice, approved it, and watched as Lawrence printed it on his portable printer. The letter was coldly professional, laying out the facts without emotion: the transfer of $150,000 on June 15, 2016, the written acknowledgement of debt, the failure to make any payments, the calculated total with interest, the 30-day deadline for full payment. I'll get this sent out first thing tomorrow morning, Lawrence said, tucking the letter into his bag. Certified mail, return receipt requested. Your son will have to sign for it. After Lawrence left, Eleanor stood in her empty apartment and felt something shift in her chest. Not pain, the surgical pain was already fading, turning from acute to dull. This was something else, something that felt like the first crack in a dam before the flood. She was doing this, really doing this, leaving Chicago, suing her son, starting over at 75. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, Surfside Inn reservation confirmation, Hayes, Eleanor. Check-in date October 28, 2 days from now. Eleanor sat down on the couch, pulled out her old road atlas. She'd never trusted GPS entirely and traced the route with her finger. Chicago to Omaha, roughly 7 hours. Omaha to Cheyenne, another 7. Cheyenne to Boise, 8 hours. Boise to Cannon Beach, 9 hours with the mountain passes. 31 hours of driving, spread over 4 days. She'd take it slow, stop when she was tired, stay in budget motels and eat at roadside diners. She'd cross the plains and the Rockies and the high desert, watching the landscape change with every mile until finally she'd crest the Coast Range and see the Pacific stretched out before her like a promise. At midnight, Eleanor made one final sweep of the apartment. Tomorrow, the landlord would come for the keys. The furniture would go to Goodwill. The photographs of David would stay in their box, headed for a storage unit Patricia had offered to manage. Everything that mattered was already packed in her car. Eleanor locked the door behind her, walked down 3 flights of stairs that her heart managed without protest, and stood on the sidewalk in the cool October night. The street was quiet, just a few cars passing, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Somewhere in Lincoln Park, David was probably sleeping, unaware that in the morning, a certified letter would arrive, unaware that his mother had already left him behind in every way that mattered. Eleanor got into her Honda Civic, started the engine, and sat there for a long moment with her hands on the steering wheel. Then she smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was real. And it was all hers. The Honda Civic's engine turned over on the 3rd try, coughing like an old man with pneumonia before settling into its familiar rattling rhythm. Eleanor had loaded everything the night before, 8 boxes wedged into the trunk and back seat, 3 suitcases, a cooler with sandwiches and water bottles, her medications in a small insulated bag on the passenger seat. It was 5:30 in the morning on October 28. The streets of Chicago were still dark, streetlights casting orange pools on empty sidewalks. Eleanor had chosen this hour deliberately early enough to avoid traffic, late enough that she wouldn't be driving in complete darkness, early enough that she could be gone before David woke up and realized what she was doing. She pulled away from the curb without looking back. The city unwound around her as she drove west on the Eisenhower Expressway. Buildings gave way to industrial zones, then suburbs, then finally the open flatness of Illinois farmland. The sun rose behind her, turning her rearview mirror into a rectangle of gold, and Eleanor felt something in her chest. Loosen not the surgical staples, but something deeper. The tight band of anxiety that had been wrapped around her ribs for as long as she could remember. She was doing it. She was actually doing it. By 8 o'clock, she'd crossed into Iowa. The landscape here was different from Illinois, rolling hills instead of flat plains, the fields gold with harvested corn. Eleanor stopped at a truck stop outside Davenport for breakfast. Sitting at a Formica counter next to men in Carhartt jackets who talked about crop yields and tractor repairs. The waitress was younger than Eleanor's granddaughter would have been, if she'd had a granddaughter. Bright pink hair and a name tag that read, Kayla. What can I get you, hun? Coffee, black, and the number 3 scrambled eggs, wheat toast. Coming right up. Kayla poured the coffee without spilling a drop, a skill Eleanor recognized from her own decades serving coffee. You traveling far? Oregon. Kayla's eyes widened. That's a haul. You driving alone? I am. Good for you. There was genuine admiration in her voice. My grandma's 72 and won't drive past the county line. Says the world's gotten too big and too fast. Eleanor smiled. Maybe the world hasn't changed. Maybe your grandma just decided where her world ends. Huh, never thought of it that way. Kayla went to turn in the order, and Eleanor sipped her coffee, watching the sunrise through the truck stop windows. Her phone, the new one she'd bought yesterday with a new number nobody had, buzzed with a text from Patricia, thinking of you. Drive safe. Text when you stop for the night. Eleanor typed back, made it to Iowa. Feeling good. It was true. Despite sleeping poorly in the motel last night, despite the persistent ache in her chest, despite everything, she felt good. Better than good. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The breakfast arrived, and Eleanor ate slowly, savoring each bite. The eggs were overcooked and the toast was cold, but it tasted like freedom. By noon, she'd reached Omaha. The skyline rose from the plains like a promise, not as dramatic as Chicago, but substantial enough to feel like civilization. Eleanor found a Motel 6 near the interstate, checked in, and spent the afternoon resting. The doctor had warned her about overdoing it, and she was determined not to end up back in a hospital because of stubbornness. She called Patricia from the motel room. How are you holding up? Patricia asked. The concern in her voice was warm, uncomplicated. Not the calculated concern Eleanor had grown used to from David. I'm tired, but it's a good tired. The kind that comes from doing something instead of having something done to you. Has he tried to contact you? Eleanor knew without asking that he meant David. I wouldn't know. I blocked his numbers. Good. A pause. Eleanor, I have to tell you something. David came by this morning. He was looking for you. Eleanor's stomach tightened. What did you tell him? That you'd left town and I didn't know where you were going. He didn't believe me. Got pretty angry, actually. Said I had no right to help you make bad decisions. I'm sorry he dragged you into this. Don't be. I told him the only bad decision you made was waiting 48 years to put yourself first. Patricia laughed, but it had an edge. He didn't like that much. Jessica had to practically drag him back to their car. Eleanor closed her eyes, picturing the scene. Part of her felt guilty, the old part, the part that had spent decades smoothing things over and keeping peace. But a newer, stronger part felt something else entirely. Satisfaction. Lawrence sent the demand letter yesterday, right? Certified mail. It'll be delivered tomorrow or the day after. David will have to sign for it. Thank you, Patricia, for everything. You'd do the same for me. Now get some rest. You've got a long way to go tomorrow. That evening, Eleanor walked to a nearby Applebee's for dinner. The restaurant was half empty, decorated with local sports memorabilia and faded photographs of Omaha's history. She ordered a chicken Caesar salad and a glass of wine, her first alcohol since before the surgery. The wine was cheap and slightly too sweet, but Eleanor drank it anyway, feeling sophisticated and rebellious in equal measure. Around her, families ate dinner and couples on dates leaned close over appetizers. She was the only person eating alone, but for the first time in her life, that didn't feel like a failure. It felt like a choice. Day 2 took her through Nebraska into Wyoming. The landscape changed dramatically. The rolling farmland gave way to scrubland, then to the dramatic rise of the Front Range. Eleanor stopped in Cheyenne for the night, checking into a Best Western that was nicer than she'd planned to spend money on. But her back was screaming and she needed a proper bed. She soaked in the bathtub carefully, mindful of her incision, and felt her muscles slowly unknot. In the mirror afterwards, she examined the scar running down her chest. It was red and angry looking, the staples still in place, but it was healing. She'd go back to Chicago in 6 weeks to have them removed, or maybe she'd find a doctor in Cannon Beach. Maybe she'd never go back to Chicago at all. That night, she slept 10 hours straight and woke feeling more rested than she had in months. Day 3 was the hardest. The drive from Cheyenne to Boise took her through the high plains of Wyoming, then the mountains of northern Utah and southern Idaho. The elevation changes made her ears pop and her heart work harder than it wanted to. Twice, she had to pull over and rest, sitting in parking lots with her eyes closed and her hand pressed to her chest. But she didn't turn back. In Boise, she found a small diner near her motel, a family-owned place called The Griddle. The owner was a woman about Eleanor's age with kind eyes and flour on her apron. You look tired, honey. Long day? Long 3 days. I'm driving from Chicago to the Oregon coast. The woman's eyebrows rose. That's quite a journey. What takes you out there? Eleanor opened her mouth to give a polite, vague answer, the kind she'd perfected over a lifetime of not wanting to burden people with her problems. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the distance from Chicago. Maybe it was simply that she was tired of lying. I'm starting over. My son told me I'd lived long enough and keeping me alive was too expensive, so I'm starting a new life without him. The woman stared at her for a long moment. Then she reached across the counter and squeezed Eleanor's hand. Good for you, honey. Good for you. Dinner's on the house tonight. Eleanor tried to protest, but the woman, her name was Carol, wouldn't hear it. She brought Eleanor the special pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans, homemade rolls, and a slice of apple pie for dessert. While Eleanor ate, Carol sat with her during the slow evening hour and talked about her own life, a daughter who'd moved to Seattle and rarely called, a husband who died 5 years ago, the joy of running the diner that had been in her family for 40 years. Sometimes, Carol said, the family we make is more important than the family we're born into. Eleanor thought about that as she drove the final leg to Cannon Beach the next morning. The route took her through the mountains of eastern Oregon pine forests and winding roads that made her clutch the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Then down into the Columbia River Gorge, following the water west as the landscape gradually changed from high desert to temperate rainforest. She stopped at Multnomah Falls, standing at the base and staring up at the water cascading 600 feet down the cliff face. Tourists crowded around her, taking selfies and chattering in a dozen languages. Eleanor just stood there, feeling the mist on her face, feeling small and insignificant in the best possible way. The final stretch took her along Highway 26, through the Coast Range. The road twisted through old-growth forest Douglas firs and Sitka spruce that had been growing since before she was born. The air smelled different here. Clean, green, alive. And then, cresting one final hill, she saw it. The Pacific Ocean. Eleanor pulled into a turnout and got out of the car, her legs shaky from 4 days of driving. The ocean stretched before her like a living thing, gray-green and restless, waves breaking white against dark rocks. The wind hit her face, carrying salt and the smell of kelp, and something in her chest cracked wide open. She'd made it, 75 years old, 8 days post-surgery, 2,137 miles from Chicago, and she'd made it. Eleanor stood there for a long time, watching the waves, feeling the wind, tasting the salt on her lips. Behind her, the Honda Civic ticked as the engine cooled. Ahead of her, somewhere in the small town of Cannon Beach, was a motel room with her name on the reservation. Beyond that, in 30 days, would be a condo 3 blocks from this very ocean. Her phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. "Did you make it?" Eleanor typed back with fingers that shook slightly from exhaustion and emotion. "I'm here. I'm at the ocean. Patricia, I can't explain it, but I feel like I just woke up from a 48-year sleep." The response came quickly. "You did. Welcome to your life, Eleanor." Eleanor got back in the car and drove the final 10 miles to Cannon Beach. The town was small, one main street lined with galleries and restaurants, a famous rock formation jutting from the beach like a haystack. The Surfside Inn sat at the north end of town, a modest 2-story building with blue siding and white trim. The owner, a man in his 60s named Tom, checked her in with efficiency and warmth. "Staying a month, right? At least, maybe longer. Well, welcome to Cannon Beach. It's a good place for new beginnings." He handed her a key, an actual metal key, not a card. "Room 212, 2nd floor, ocean view. Best room in the house." Eleanor climbed the stairs slowly, her suitcase bumping against her legs. Unlocked the door, stepped inside. The room was simple: a queen bed, a small table, a kitchenette with a 2-burner stove. But the window looked directly at the ocean, and in the fading October light, it was the most beautiful thing Eleanor had ever seen. She sat on the bed, pulled out her phone, and did something she hadn't done in years. She took a selfie. Not a good one. Her hair was windblown, her face tired, her surgical scar visible above the collar of her shirt. But she was smiling, really smiling. She sent it to Patricia with the caption, "Day 1. Then she lay back on the bed, listened to the sound of waves through the open window, and for the first time since the surgery, maybe for the first time in 48 years, Eleanor Hayes fell asleep without worrying about anyone but herself. Tomorrow, she would unpack. She would explore the town. She would start figuring out her new life. But tonight, she would simply rest. She had earned it. 3 weeks passed like water over stones, slowly reshaping everything. Eleanor woke each morning to the sound of waves and the cry of seagulls. She'd open the window of room 212 and breathe in air that tasted of salt and possibility. Then she'd make coffee in the little kitchenette and sit by the window, watching the ocean change colors with the light. The town revealed itself gradually. She discovered the coffee shop on Hemlock Street where locals gathered before the tourists woke up. She found the library, small but well-stocked, where a librarian named Susan recommended books about Oregon history. She walked the beach every afternoon, her steps growing stronger each day, her chest hurting less. People here didn't ask questions. They simply nodded hello, commented on the weather, let her be. It was exactly what she needed. On the 10th day, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Mrs. Hayes? This is Lawrence Chen. Eleanor's stomach tightened. She'd almost forgotten about the demand letter, lost in the rhythm of her new life. He paid. Lawrence's voice carried a note of surprise. Full amount plus interest. $210,000. Wired to my trust account this morning. I can transfer it to your account within 48 hours. Eleanor sat down slowly on the bed. He paid. The check cleared an hour ago. He also sent a letter. Do you want me to read it? No. The word came out sharper than she intended. I don't want to know what it says. Just transfer the money, please. Will do. Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes. Not many people have the courage to do what you did. After he hung up, Eleanor sat for a long time, staring at the ocean. $210,000. More money than she'd ever had at once in her entire life. Money that had been hers all along, finally returned. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt free. That afternoon, she met with Melissa Turner at the condo. It was a small place, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. A combined living room and kitchen, but the windows faced west toward the ocean and the floors were real hardwood. It's perfect, Eleanor said. Really? Because I know it needs work. The bathroom tile is original from 1985, and the kitchen could use updating. It's perfect, Eleanor repeated. How soon can we close? If your financing is ready, we could close next week. I'm paying cash. Melissa's eyes widened. Cash? The full 180? Yes. 10 days later, Eleanor signed the papers at a title company in Seaside. She wrote a check for $180,000, the largest check she'd ever written, and received a key to a home that was entirely, completely hers. No landlord, no mortgage, no one who could take it away. She moved in on November 20th, carrying her 8 boxes up the stairs herself despite Tom from the Surfside Inn insisting he could help. She wanted to do it alone. Needed to prove she could. That first night in her own place, Eleanor sat on the floor. She hadn't bought furniture yet and ate takeout Chinese food from the one restaurant in town. Through the window, she watched the sunset paint the ocean in shades of orange and purple and gold. Her phone buzzed. Patricia, tell me you're settling in okay. Eleanor took a photo of the sunset and sent it back. More than okay. I'm home. The word surprised her as she typed it. Home. She'd lived in Chicago for 75 years, but she'd never felt what she felt right now, this bone-deep sense of belonging. Over the following weeks, Eleanor built a life. She bought furniture from thrift stores and estate sales, a couch, a kitchen table, a bed that was new because the doctor had been adamant about proper support for her healing sternum. She hung curtains. She planted herbs in pots on her tiny balcony. She made friends. Carol from the coffee shop invited her to a book club. Tom from the Surfside Inn introduced her to his wife, who ran a watercolor painting class at the community center. Eleanor hadn't painted since high school, but she signed up anyway. Her first attempt was terrible, a muddy blob that was supposed to be the ocean. But her second was better. And her third showed actual promise. You've got an eye for color, the instructor said, and Eleanor felt something warm bloom in her chest. Pride. In herself. For herself. On Christmas Eve, Eleanor walked down to the beach at sunset. The air was cold and sharp, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She was alone. The tourists had mostly left after Thanksgiving, and the locals were inside with their families. But Eleanor didn't feel lonely. She thought about David, wondered if he was celebrating Christmas with Jessica, if they ever talked about her, if he felt the absence of his mother the way she'd once felt his absence. Then she let the thoughts go, released them like birds into the wind. She pulled out her phone and opened her photos. The newest ones showed her life here, sunsets, her painted attempts at seascapes, the coffee shop where everyone now knew her order. But she scrolled back further, to the selfie she'd taken that first day in the motel room. The woman in that photo looked tired, uncertain, scared. Eleanor opened the camera and took another selfie. Same woman, but different. Stronger, calmer, smiling a smile that reached her eyes. She sent it to Patricia with a simple message, 3 months later. Patricia responded immediately. You look 20 years younger. Oregon agrees with you. Eleanor looked at the two photos side by side. Patricia was right. She did look different, But it wasn't Oregon that had changed her. It was choosing herself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor made a decision. Tomorrow, she would start writing. Not a book, necessarily. Maybe just her story. The story of a woman who spent 75 years living for other people before finally learning to live for herself. Maybe no one would read it. Maybe it would sit in a drawer forever. But it would exist, and that would be enough. Eleanor walked back to her condo as the stars began to appear. Inside, she made tea and sat by the window, watching the ocean disappear into darkness. The waves kept coming regardless, steady, relentless, eternal. Like her heartbeat, like her breath, like this new life she'd built from the ashes of the old one. At 75 years old, Eleanor Hayes was finally, truly alive. And she had no intention of stopping now.